Okay, so picking up the story from where we left off with the death of Baldwin the First, Jerusalem is still in a state of a lot of uncertainty. They have made some gains in terms of consolidating their position, but as we'll see over the course of the next few decades, continued threats from sort of external enemies, particularly Muslims, but also the Byzantine Empire, as well as sort of internal problems, are really going to create a lot of turmoil. And the quote here, "a bottomless gulf of enmity," is how William of Tyre describes the situation during this period. And this is William of Tyre, whose History of Deeds Done Beyond the Sea is just such an incredible source of events that happened during this period. William also includes a lot of detail that we don't see in most histories of this period, which makes his source incredibly valuable to historians. Unfortunately, it's one of the only Western authored sources we have during this period. So sometimes it's dangerous to rely a little too much on William's perspective of events just because he was very personally involved. So we know he was born in Jerusalem around 1130, which also makes his perspective unique because he's writing from sort of on the ground as opposed to away in Western Europe. We do know that he had sort of a typical European education, though. He spent some time studying in Paris and also at the University of Bologna. So while his proximity and his local point of view do create a lot of confidence in his reliability, we know also that he was appointed the tutor to the young Baldwin IV. And so his sort of personal involvement in sort of the royal family does make us a little bit suspicious of some of the way he presents things. So Baldwin II then becomes the next king of Jerusalem following the death of Baldwin I. They are related. We're not quite sure how. Baldwin Le Borc is the name of this Baldwin. He became Count of Edessa when Baldwin I left Edessa to succeed his brother Godfrey in Jerusalem. So we think they're probably sort of cousins. Baldwin wasn't necessarily designated as Baldwin I's successor. When Baldwin I dies, he falls ill, so it's very sudden. It's not really clear what's going to happen. So you do have sort of a high court in Jerusalem, a group of sort of leading nobles and ecclesiastical officials, and they sort of are of two minds. The one is that they need to kind of stick with the family of Godfrey and Baldwin I. And so they do send an embassy to Western Europe to sort of seek out their brother Eustace of Bologna and to get him to come take the crown. But there's another sort of group within Jerusalem that actually feels they can't wait and they need someone in place, and they have an ideal candidate in Baldwin Le Borc, who happens to be in Jerusalem at the time. He also happens to have the support of the church, as well as some powerful sort of local nobles, particularly Jocelyn, who then, Jocelyn of Courtenay, is appointed the next sort of Count of Edessa once Baldwin II is crowned. This is an image here of Baldwin being crowned. A lot of these images come from various versions of William of Tyre's chronicle, and he's crowned in the Holy Sepulchre alongside his wife Morphia. Morphia is actually an Armenian Christian who Baldwin met in the Latin East, one of a number of sort of leading figures amongst the Crusaders who does marry Armenian women. So this is just to kind of help you sort through some of these individuals and their relationships with each other. So these are the descendants of Baldwin II and Morphia, though they do leave out his youngest daughter, Evetta, who becomes an abbess. He doesn't have, these are the children he has when he becomes king, and then Evetta is born after he's king. As you can see, they're all girls. And so moving forward, this is going to be an issue. How are they going to deal with succession? Female succession, there is a precedent. Around the same time, you have Matilda of England succeeding, but as some of you know, that does not go well. And so there's going to be a lot of conversations about what to do moving forward. In the meantime, Baldwin sort of sets about consolidating not only his position on the throne, but also sort of the borders of Jerusalem. The biggest challenge, Jerusalem itself is fairly secure, but the biggest challenge for Baldwin is what's going on in the north, what's happening in the Crusader Principality of Antioch, which is really hard pressed on a number of fronts. He also then is mindful of securing the southern border against the Fatimids. They were sort of the immediate threat in 1099. Because of events going on there, they haven't really been able to continue to press against the southern border, but there's still something for Baldwin to be concerned about. In 1123, in an attempt to actually relieve a siege, Baldwin, along with Jocelyn, are in the countryside near Aleppo in the north, and Baldwin is captured by Balak of Aleppo. He is held prisoner for, I think, 9 months. And during that time, then, sort of governing in the kingdom falls to a number of sort of leading officials. We don't think his wife Morphia was super active in governing, but we do know that she was very active in raising the ransom and securing his release. Moving forward, this becomes sort of the typical way of dealing with these situations when a very high-ranking individual is captured by the other side. They're not killed, they're held for ransom. And this is obviously an image of Baldwin being taken into captivity by Balak and his men. While Baldwin is in captivity, the Crusader forces manage to capture the city of Tyre. This is a huge sort of win for them. You can see Tyre along the sea, located between Sidon and Acre. This gives them access to a port, which is really essential, and it also allows them to fortify that coast against any sort of Muslim attacks. The Kingdom of Jerusalem does not have a fleet of its own, so a number of these Italian city-states like Genoa and Venice are really make significant contributions to a lot of the naval warfare. And so it's the Venetian fleet that's really sort of instrumental in their ability to capture Tyre. The city of Tyre itself is extremely well fortified. It has double walls near the ocean, and then on the landlocked side, it has triple walls. It ends up being a 6-month siege. Eventually, the people of Tyre capitulate, and in return for their assistance, the Venetians are granted a third of the area within the city to settle their population. So a lot of these are sort of merchants or traders who have already been sort of actively trading with the region, but this gives them sort of firmer ground and a foothold into those markets. Baldwin does he does make an offer for the population if they want to leave. So a lot of Muslims, a lot of Eastern Orthodox Christians are living there. If they want to leave, they're free to do so. There's no retribution, but actually most of them seem to choose to remain. And sometimes we see these notions that the Crusades actually accelerate trade between the East and the West. Or they initiate trade between East and the West, and they open up markets to each side, is not really the case. Historians have discovered more recently, but it does sort of accelerate that trade, the volume that they're trading, and their ability to move goods back and forth from places further in Asia up into Western Europe. So the question of succession then becomes more and more pressing as it becomes clear as Baldwin ages along with his wife Morphia, and it becomes clear that they're not going to have any more children. So in the absence of a son, Baldwin really does sort of change the way succession works within the kingdom, and this is going to have really important implications moving forward. He decides that he wants to establish hereditary succession within the family. There are lots of different ways that can look. Ideally, according to primogeniture, it passes along the line of the eldest male offspring. Since there are no male offspring, it could go to a nephew or an uncle if you want a privileged male offspring. But what Baldwin decides is that he actually wants to sort of privilege his line, and so he designates his eldest daughter, Melisande, to succeed him. She actually starts actively participating in governing even before he dies. He does know, though, that it's going to be important for him to choose someone who the rest of the nobles have confidence in to sort of marry her, because whoever marries her then is going to be in a position of significant prominence. So the leaders of Jerusalem sort of meet, and they decide that they think a good candidate for marriage is Folk of Anjou. Folk of Anjou is in northern France. He is well known by the members of the royal court. He's been on crusade once or twice. He actually is financially supporting the Knights Templar, and so he's sort of a known quantity. He seems to have some commitment to Jerusalem, and so he designates his son back in England to succeed him as Count of Anjou, and he comes down to Jerusalem where he and Melisende are married. In 1131, then shortly after that, Baldwin II dies, and then as you see depicted in this image, Folk and Melisende are crowned. There is some speculation as to what the exact nature of their relationship is. I would argue that they were crowned as co-rulers. It seems very clear that on his deathbed, Baldwin II expects them to rule sort of jointly, and then eventually for the crown to pass to any offspring that they have. Okay, so we're going to take a slight diversion up north into the Principality of Antioch, because obviously all of these events are sort of interchangeable, and what happens across the region is going to impact everybody else. And it's a little tricky because some of this stuff overlaps a bit, but I'll try and sort of be as clear as possible. So Antioch was then ruled by Bohemond I in the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade. So he was one of the principal actors in the First Crusade. He establishes control of Antioch. He leaves in 1104 to go recruit additional men. He comes back to Italy. He never actually comes back to Antioch. He returns to Italy around 1106, and then he decides he actually, instead of taking the troops and the recruits to Antioch, he attacks the Byzantine Empire. And this is really important because he attacks the Byzantine Empire, he loses, and he's forced to swear an oath to the Byzantine emperor that he holds the Principality of Antioch from the Byzantine emperor. So he acknowledges that the Byzantine emperor is the overlord of Antioch. This is something he always resisted from when he became in charge of Antioch. And so it's acknowledging sort of a subordinate role for Antioch that's going to be important moving forward. In any case, he goes back to Italy and he dies. Since his departure in 1104, the person in charge on the ground is his nephew Tancred. And so Tancred has been ruling very, very effectively, making some significant conquests in terms of particularly port cities like Latakia. But Tancred dies himself in 1112. Bohemond does have a son, but he's still very young. And so he stays in Italy with his mother during this time. So Roger of Salerno, then, who is Tancred's nephew, assumes control of Antioch as regent for Bohemond II. And then he's going to continue in that role until 1119. Antioch, way more so than Jerusalem, is really pressed from the north by this Byzantine pressure. Because of the oath that Bohemond I swore to the Byzantine emperor, the Byzantine emperors are saying, hey, we know he's dead, but you guys still have to acknowledge our authority, which the princes of Antioch don't want to do. There's also rising Muslim pressure in the east, particularly from the city of Aleppo, which you can see is just outside the border of the Principality of Antioch. So in 1119, there's a major battle fought. It becomes known as the Battle of Ager Sanguinis, the Field of Blood, in part because it is so devastating. Roger of Antioch is sort of lured into the field by Ilghazi, the ruler of Aleppo. Roger is in his fortress at Arta, and he knows that he's outnumbered. He sends for reinforcements. In particular, he sends down to Baldwin for reinforcements, but for some reason, we don't know why, he doesn't wait for them to show up. Instead, he meets Ilghazi on the field of battle, and he is absolutely annihilated. We know that Roger himself is killed. Around 7,000 of his men are killed, and you can imagine what a blow that would be to already sort of undermanned army in the Crusader states. We know the Muslims only lose about 20 men, so it's a very one-sided battle. Baldwin then arrives shortly after, and he is able then to sort of catch Ilghazi by surprise and defeat him. But in many respects, the damage has already been done. We know that Baldwin then becomes the regent of Antioch. And he actually makes attempts to sort of remarry so many of the women who have been sort of widowed as a result of the Battle of the Field of Blood. So, in part because of the death of Roger and the situation in Antioch, Bohemond sends an embassy, or Baldwin sends an embassy to Bohemond II, who is still in Italy, and says, hey, it's time for you to come take over responsibility for Antioch. And by this time, Bohemond is in his teens. He's like 17, 18. The terms are that he's going to come, he's going to take over Antioch, but he's going to marry Alice, Baldwin's daughter, in order to sort of solidify this alliance between Antioch and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He does successfully sort of expand control north into Cilicia, that region sort of in the north. We know that Bohemond is described, particularly by William of Tyre, as a very accomplished military commander. You can see him pictured here marrying Alice. However, he also does seem to have some issues, some personal issues. So, for example, in 1127, he is feuding with Jocelyn of Edessa. This feud is actually escalates into war. So at one point when Bohemond is away from Antioch, Jocelyn invades. But before it can really, and eventually it's resolved, Baldwin sort of steps in and says, hey, you two need to get along. But in 1130, after only 4 years, Bohemond himself is killed in battle. He's defeated by a local Muslim ruler. His head is cut off, and it's sent to the Caliph as sort of a sign of the Muslim victory. So then the question is, what's going to happen in Antioch? Bohemond and Alice did have a child. They had one daughter named Constance. She is still very young. She's like 3 or 4. Because they want to honor this notion of hereditary succession, they have to find out sort of who's going to rule as regent for her. Most of Bohemond's the first extended family have all been killed as regents of Antioch. So Constance's mother, Alice, attempts to step up and declares that she should be regent for her daughter. This is very, very tricky stuff, and it's really unclear exactly what happens. But we know that while Alice has the support of some of the nobles in Antioch, there's some of the nobles in Antioch that don't support her. They appeal to her father, Baldwin. Baldwin sends her a letter saying, you need to give up power. This is not acceptable. She refuses. Baldwin invades Antioch and actually allows her to sort of withdraw from the city of Antioch to her dower lands in Latakia along the coast. And then he installs a regent in her place. And these are some ruins of Latakia, which is a very powerful, wealthy city. And it's very clear that in spite of the fact that her father actually was forced to militarily invade, they still are on pretty good terms, and she hasn't given up. In 1131, Baldwin II dies. I'll talk about the implications for that on the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a second. But we know that it has serious implications for Antioch. Once again, Alice attempts to rule as regent. Since Baldwin was ruling as regent, now there's a power vacuum. She forms an alliance with Pons, who is Count of Tripoli. Pons supports her bid for power, but Fulk, who is king of Jerusalem now, so Alice's brother-in-law, is forced to invade. Pons meets him at sort of a midpoint as Fulk is trying to march towards Antioch. Pons intercepts him with an army at Rugia. Pons's forces are defeated, and so Fulk manages to enter Antioch to remove Alice from power and to appoint his own regent. Shortly after that, Alice is going to make one more bid for power. She's definitely very obstinate. This time, Fulk says, okay, the only way we're going to solve this and prevent this from happening is to bring in someone to marry Constance and take over as regent. So he summons Raymond of Poitiers, who is the son of the Duke of Aquitaine. Raymond is probably in his mid-20s, late 20s by now, a proven military commander. Fulk brings him to Antioch to marry Constance. The reason why this is a little problematic is because Constance is only like 7 or 8. And so even for medieval marriages, that's really, really young. But in any case, the two get married and Alice is forced to sort of give up her attempts to take power of Antioch. Eventually, however, Raymond himself is forced to acknowledge the overlordship of the Emperor of Byzantium. So the Byzantines invade Antioch. Raymond appeals to Fulk for support. Fulk actually is forced to say, I'm sorry, I've got my hands full. I can't come help you. You better give the emperor what he wants. And so from here on out, the relationship between Antioch and Byzantium is going to change considerably. As Raymond is forced to acknowledge sort of the subordination of Antioch to the Byzantine Empire. And we'll come back to Raymond later. He'll be a key player in the Second Crusade. And you can see this is a depiction of his marriage to Constance, though she probably was about half as tall in real life as she is depicted in that image. Okay, because things aren't messy enough, Fulk and Melisande are crowned in 1131 with the death of Baldwin II. As I said before, it seems clear to me, though not all historians agree, that Fulk and Melisande were intended to be co-rulers by Baldwin II. However, Fulk doesn't seem to be too keen on that arrangement. Our information is sketchy, but we do know in the first few years following their succession, Melisande is basically absent from governing. And Fulk seems to be determined to sort of govern solo without her. He also replaces a lot of the local nobles with men that he brought with him from Anjou. This makes a lot of the locals really unhappy. In 1133, there is, I don't want to go into too much detail because it's just super complicated, but a local noble, Hugh of Jaffa, who is sort of a second generation crusader, who is Melisandre's cousin, actually makes accusations against Fulk of treason. Fulk exiles Hugh. Hugh goes to the court of Alice up in Latakia, where he sort of hangs out for a bit. He eventually is summoned back to Jerusalem to stand trial for his accusations against Fulk. In the meantime, a Breton knight, so a knight from Brittany, and that's what this picture, this illustration depicts, a knight from Brittany tries to assassinate him when he returns to Jerusalem. He isn't killed, but he's seriously wounded and he dies shortly later. We don't know exactly how this plays into things, but you have this polarization at court, the supporters of Melisande and Hugh, and the supporters of Fulk. We don't know exactly why the two groups fell out, but we do know that eventually, by 1136, the rift between Fulk and Melisande is not only repaired, she's fully restored to a position of active governance. And from then on, Fulk and Melisande do rule Jerusalem sort of jointly, and she's a very active player in government. In 1137, Fulk manages to capture a key fortress, Manyas, in the north, sort of securing that border of Jerusalem. But in 1143, he's only in his 40s. He's pretty young. He and Melisande are at Acre. So they're sort of at their palace in Acre along the coast. It's sort of kind of on a vacation. They go for sort of a day's like a picnic, and so they're riding on their horses outside the city. At one point, a hare, William of Tyre tells us this in great detail. A hare jumps out in front of Folk's horse. Folk tries to chase down the hare, and in doing so, his horse stumbles. He's thrown from the horse. He hits the ground. He's unconscious but alive until his saddle, which is thrown when he's thrown and flies up into the air, comes down and hits him directly on the head and splits open his skull. And so after a few days, Folk dies. So, and Melisande apparently was very upset. So Folk dies prematurely. The question of what's going to happen next then is not quite as unclear as previously, because Baldwin III, their elder son, is like 13. So age of majority is usually 15, 16. So then Melisande and Baldwin are crowned on December 5th in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That should actually say 1143, not 1043. Melisande has proven herself as someone fully capable of governing. She has a very close relationship with her son Baldwin. Things look to be sort of a smooth succession. We are not entirely clear, again, exactly what the relationship is here. Is she regent for him, or is she co-ruling with him? I would argue that she's co-ruling with him, though some other scholars might disagree with me. Well, they do disagree with me on that. But in any case, in 1143, in spite of that premature death of Folk, succession is secured, and you still have stability within the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But what does all of this add up to? Obviously, in 1144, you have a previous few decades of a lot of internal dissent, a lot of factionalism. So you have these people who are sort of second, third generation crusaders who feel like they should have more of a voice in affairs versus these new men like Folk and Folk's followers, Raymond of Poitiers, these men who much more recently came down to Jerusalem. They bring their supporters with them, and they don't always see eye to eye on a lot of things, including sort of what policies to pursue moving forward. The new men, in a lot of instances, are very critical of the people who've been there for several generations in terms of their dress, in terms of their adoption of some sort of local customs, particularly like sort of how you eat, the foods you eat. Hygiene is really important to the local culture. So there's this division there. There's also division between the different rulers of the Crusader states. So we saw that with Bohemond II and Jocelyn. This is continued. So this particular image shows Raymond of Poitiers, and he's playing chess with Jocelyn of Edessa. This is right on the eve of the Second Crusade. The Emperor of Byzantium comes down with an army, and he says to Raymond and Jocelyn, let's go attack the Muslim ruler of Aleppo so that we can sort of stabilize our position in the north. Jocelyn and Raymond refuse to join him because they just have their own axes to grind. So while he's laying siege to Aleppo, they play chess, and that's what that checkered board is intended to illustrate there. So they're busy playing chess. The emperor has to call up the campaign for other reasons, but it's this illustration of instead of working together, the various crusader states are actually at times at odds with each other. And so that diminishes their ability to really effectively defeat these external threats to the stability of the crusader states, the Byzantines, the Fatimids in Egypt, and then the Turks. And the Turks in particular, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, are really in a position where they're flipping the script. So while the Crusader states are disunited, the Turks in particular are really trying to unite their forces. They're invoking ideas about jihad. They're calling for an expulsion of these sort of foreign crusaders. And we'll start to see things increasingly deteriorate for the Crusader states and their control of these territories in the Latin East.